Welcome back to the Army Painter Academy, where we're excited to share another fantastic tutorial from our studio team. Today we are heading back into the world of the John Blanche Masterclass paint sets, but this time with a different battlefield and a very different hero. Previously, studio painters Joachim and Tyler painted a massive Horus Heresy Saturnine Terminator, with one painter using the cool palette and the other using the warm palette from the latest John Blanche Masterclass Volumes. Same miniature, same paint system, two very different outcomes. So today we're exploring that same idea through the lens of the Age of Sigmar, Cities of Sigmar, Freeguild Marshal. This is a fantastic miniature for an exercise like this. It's full of character, ornate armor, layered fabrics, leather equipment, metals, and plenty of opportunities to play with color, temperature, and mood. Once again, we are working with Masterclass Volumes 3 and 4, developed in collaboration with the legendary artist and wargaming visionary John Blanche. We'll use predominantly Volumes 3 and 4, but throughout this video you'll see other colors from the Masterclass range alongside select paints from the Warpaints Fanatic and Speed Paint ranges. We even got some air paints mixed in there, wherever they help reinforce the look each painter is chasing. Because miniature painting isn't about limiting yourself, it's about understanding your tools well enough to use them with intent. And if at any point you're sitting at home thinking, wait, I could actually do that? Good, that's exactly the point. So let's paint. Well, with this tutorial, we're going to start where every miniature literally touches the base. And this is no simple base coat. We're using a mix of Root Path, Thicket Grove, and Umber Root, applied with the Wargamer Speed Paint No. 3 brush. Pay attention to this mix because it's going to be seen throughout the remainder of this tutorial. So rather than covering the whole base in one flat color, he alternates with those tones to create a more natural, uneven surface right from the beginning. Real ground rarely looks like one color, and introducing variation this early helps keep the base from feeling flat later on. Next, we're talking with Tyler, and he's painting the inner cloak. He begins establishing the first highlights using Shadowthorn with the Wargamer Detail brush. He starts pushing the brightness by mixing in Dew Path, building the highlight gradually across the raised folds. Instead of jumping straight to the bright edge, working in transition, up in stages, Shadowthorn and Dew Path, and pure Dew Path on the highest points. That slow build is what gives the fabric that smooth, sketchy, almost painterly look. To soften the transition, he comes back in with a thinned glaze of Shadowthorn, again with the same brush. This gently pulls the brighter areas back into the midtone and smooths the blends without killing the contrast. Once that settles, he pushes the brightest folds even further with a mix of Sky Shard and Dew Path. At this stage, the cloak is already starting to feel like cloth catching light rather than just painted color. While Tyler shifts to paint all of the leather elements on the miniature, we're going to check in with Joachim, who is now shifted his attention to the face. And this is where the character of the miniature really starts to come alive. He mixes Umber Root and Hearthborn in a 1-to-1 ratio for the base coat. Once that base is down, he begins building the highlights gradually, adding more Hearthborn into that mix. This is such a classic layering approach. Rather than jumping between separate colors, he slowly shifts the ratio brighter while keeping the transition neutral. Using a mix of the darkness and Hearthborn, he shades the area under the eyes with a Wargamer Detail brush. Faces benefit enormously from subtle contrast, and deepening those shadows around the eyes immediately adds age, intensity, and definition. To bring back some life into the skin, Joachim then applies a very thin glaze of Bloodthorn mixed with some Warpaint Stabilizer. This adds a touch of warmth and variation to the complexion without overpowering the earlier work. Glazing like this is a great way to make skin feel richer and more natural. Next up is the hair. Joachim starts with a 2-to-2-to-1 mix of Umber Root, Ironclad Gray, and Ivory White as the base coat, and he's going to apply this once again with a detail brush. It gives the hair a slightly desaturated, weathered, almost gray look that suits the veteran look of the sculpt. He then moves into a 1-to-1-to-1 mix of the same colors for the highlights, this time using the Wargamer Speed Paint No. 3 brush. The larger bristles will help him to catch the raised strands and build texture a little bit easier. Going back to the cheeks and the face, he's just going to finish off the highlights with some Hearthborn, then pushes the brightest points further with a 1-to-1 mix with Ivory White. These final touches are what sharpen the light direction, help define the silhouette of this miniature. And you know what, at this point, with the face fully fleshed out like this miniature is already starting to come together. We're going to shift back to Tyler, who begins tackling all of the silver metallic elements using a true metallic metal. For the plate armor, he starts with a base coat of plate mail metal using the Wargamer layering brush. The armor paints are broad enough that the larger brush helps move that metallic paint smoothly while giving control around the edges and the details. Applying that first smooth coat is super important with metallics. They look best when the application is clean and even, and there's nobody cleaner than Tyler Mengel. Tyler then turns to the chainmail and hammer, applying heavy metal as the base coat. Using slightly different metallic tones across different parts of the miniature helps to break up the monotony and keeps the armor from feeling too uniform. Now that Tyler has achieved that smooth layer of plate mail metal, he's going to apply a cool shade or wash using Pine Hollow Shade, tinting the armor while still defining the recesses. With the base metals in place, he deepens the shadows using Grimdark Shadow as a wash, applied with the Wargamer layering brush. This does settle naturally into the recesses of the chainmail and the weapon details, immediately adding depth and contrast. And on textured surfaces like the chainmail, washes do most of that heavy lifting for you. Once that wash is dried, Tyler returns with plate mail metal for highlights on the armor plates. The ultra-fine point of his Wargamer Insane Detail brush lets him restore brightness to the highest surfaces while leaving darker recesses intact. Yeah, it's simply base coat, wash, highlight. Very simple, very reliable, very effective, but when Tyler does it, it just looks next level. From there, we jump back to Joachim with a pass on the cloak. He lays down a warm base using a mix of Ember Veil with a little bit of stabilizer. You know, this is a big, broad surface, so he wants to make sure this lays on nice and smooth. I bet he's going to go ahead and apply a second or maybe even a third thin coat using his Wargamer layering brush. He then begins to introduce environmental variation across the lower half with a 1-to-1 mix of Ember Veil and Root Path. These are similar colors from before, building in some of this natural weathering and grounding that fabric in the setting. To deepen the folds and unify the whole surface, Joachim applies Vine Root Shade with the Wargamer Speed Paint brush. While Joachim's wash dries, Tyler moves ahead with his cloak. Here he's starting with a 1-to-1 mix of Bramble Grove and the Darkness applied with the Wargamer layering brush. This gives him a cool, desaturated foundation that immediately contrasts with Joachim's warmer palette. From there, Tyler builds the shadows using a thin mix of Bramble Grove, Dew Path, and the Darkness, guiding it into the folds to reinforce that shadow.
And if it becomes too stark of a transition, you can go back to, you can go back to your previous mix and just kind of layer over top and it'll all blend it in.
Yeah, Tyler's always good for a soundbite, straight from the mind of Mengel. There is actually a really good lesson in that. If your shadows go too far, you can always come back in with your midtones and restore balance, and vice versa. Painting is rarely about getting it perfect in one pass. It's about adjusting as you go. Now we get to jump to one of the most satisfying parts of miniature painting, highlighting fabrics. And this is where the two approaches really begin to separate. Joachim starts rebuilding his brighter folds with Ember Veil applied with the Wargamer Detail brush. He's not going for maximum contrast yet, just building the midtone softened by the earlier wash. Tyler's doing something similar on his side, but with Bramble Grove, again with the detail brush. Same technique, just a slightly different result, different approach. Joachim's cloak feels warmer, rougher, and more atmospheric, where Tyler's reads colder, heavier, more controlled. I'd like to think that Tyler likes to root his miniatures in contrast and tone, where Joachim likes to root them in the environment that they exist in. And just as I say that, he's reinforcing the lower portion of the cloak with a mix of Ember Veil and Root Path, giving it a dusty, weathered feel. Tyler continues to push his highlights with Bramble Grove and Sky Shard, using small, precise strokes to define the upper edges of the fabric. Joachim responds by lifting the top folds with a 4-to-1 mix of Ember Veil and Sun Petal, warming the highlights and giving that cloak that unmistakable Blanchean glow. Then there's Tyler, still sharpening his structure, moving towards Sky Shard with just a touch of Bramble Grove, almost pure Sky Shard on the sharpest folds and edges. More textures being added by Joachim, this time with some Ember Veil, Root Path, and Glade Shard, using subtle strokes to create more expressive, painterly, almost sketched finish. Pushing the final brightest points with a mix of Ember Veils, Sun Petal, and a bit of Hearthborn. When you step back and look at both of the cloaks side by side, this whole exercise starts to click, right? Two painters, two palettes, two completely different methods and moods built from the same core principles. And the same paints. Now, some of these mixes start getting a little specific. You'll see ratios like 1:1 to half, Embervale, Sunpetal, and Hearthborn, and at a certain point it starts to feel like the studio painters are just taking the and honestly, sometimes they may be, because what really matters here isn't the exact formula. What they're doing is mixing progressively brighter colors and placing them more and more selectively on the highest folds. Each layer gets a little lighter, each highlight gets a little tighter, and that's what creates depth. Tyler takes a slightly different route here, mixing the darkness with water for a thin shadow glaze. He uses this to deepen the recesses of the cloak and push the contrast even further.
And if you're happy with your level of contrast on the cape, then you can skip this step. We've already done the shadows. I just wanted to push a couple areas a little bit darker than they already were.
And he makes a really good point there. If you're happy with your shadows, you can absolutely leave them alone. But Tyler wants more contrast here, and the cloak is the largest surface on the miniature, so it naturally becomes a major focal point.
I know we're spending a lot of time on the cape compared to other areas, but this is the largest surface area on the model. And besides the face, probably the focal point that most people will see. So it's worth putting in a little bit more time.
That's a great takeaway. When one area dominates the silhouette, it's worth spending a little extra time there. With the cloaks finished, we get to one of the most interesting parts of this whole format. Normally in a tutorial, you follow one painter's process. Here, you're watching two painters tackle the same miniature at the same time. That lets you really dissect their decisions. Why one painter pushes contrast in a certain area, why another leaves shadow alone, why one leans into texture, and the other prefers cleaner blends. And it proves something I wish more painters understood earlier, is that there isn't one correct method. And honestly, that's one of the best parts of this hobby. There are no rules, just paint. While Joachim finishes the inner cloth, starting with a base coat of Bloodthorn using the Wargamer layering brush, Tyler shifts his focus to one of the most expressive parts of the model, the face. Begins with a base coat of Moonpetal and Ashroot, then starts building the structure with highlights using Iceborn Moonpetal and Ashroot, applied with the Insane Detail brush. Those highlights sit on the brow, cheekbones, nose, and chin, bringing the face forward and establishing the light. We'll refine those shadows a bit with a thin mix of Moonpetal, Ashroot, and water, carefully placing it around the eyes, beneath the cheekbones, and along the sides of the nose in those areas. And with those shadows in place, he pushes those highlights brighter, before tying it all together with a focused wash of Nightroot shade thinned with water. Because he's applying it in this controlled fashion, not flooding the face, the earlier highlight work stays crisp. And one final pass of bright highlights sharpens the expression and gives the Marshal real character. From there, Tyler moves on to the hair, starting with a base coat of Bramble Grove and Ashroot, building the highlights with Bramble Grove, Ashroot, and Sky Shard, and eventually pushing the brightest strands with a mix that is just mostly Sky Shard. It's a simple process, but it gives the hair a clean, defined finish. Jumping to Joachim, he turns to the hammer, beginning with a base coat of Umberroot using the detail brush. He applies Vineroot shade and a focused wash of Grave Hollow shade to deepen the lower portions and reinforce the form. Once those shadows are in place, he builds the highlights with a mix of Umberroot, Root Path, and Hearthborn, picking out the raised surfaces and restoring the structure of the weapon. Starting with a mix of Ironclad Grey, Umberroot, and Thicket Grove. From there, he pushes the highlights further by adding the darkness and Hearthborn, then warms the lower areas with a bit of Root Path, gradually building variation into the hammerhead. He brings everything up to the highest edge with a mix that includes a bit of ivory white, finishing with tiny accents of pure ivory white where the light hits the hardest. To root this feature further into the base, a thin glaze of Glade Shard across the lower parts will bring in a nice environmental tint. At this point, the miniature is nearly complete. When you step back, you can really see how each stage builds on the last layer by layer, wash by wash, highlight by highlight. Next, Tyler's going to move on to the hammer handle with a mix of the darkness and matte black, and then he will simply highlight that up with the addition of Bramble Grove. Just trace along the ridges of the shaft. He's going to shift to all of the gold ornamentry on the armor. Again, he's going to use a true metallic approach with Emperor Gold. The Wargamer detail brush helps him keep those lines nice and tight without painting outside the lines. At this stage, with all the hard work he's put in there, you really don't want to mess up by getting metallic paints on that beautiful cloth. He'll reinforce the contrast on the gold metallics with a thin down wash of Nightroot Shade and Speed Paint Medium. Once the wash is dried, we'll go back to the Emperor Gold and just reinforce those highlights, painting inside the lines that the wash has created for him. A great way to highlight golds is just to mix a bit of silver or something like plate mail metal, which Tyler already had on his palette here, to just simply apply that tiny metallic highlight. While Tyler's finishing up his gold effect, Joachim's going for a different approach for his metalwork, specifically with non-metallic metal. Before committing to the full non-metallic metal effect, he takes a moment to test the recipe on a smaller section on the leg armor first, and that's a smart move. Testing on a smaller area lets you dial in the highlight placement, reflections, and contrast before committing to the rest of the armor on the miniature. Using a mix of Ironclad Gray and the darkness for the steel, along with touches of Umberroot, Root Path, and Glade Shard, we're going to call this his environmental mix, because he's pulling those environmental colors into the reflections of the armor's base coat. I think from here on out, we'll just call it his kitchen sink, unless we can come up with a better name for it.
It's only for the brave, son, only for the brave.
By bringing those surrounding tones into the steel, the armor feels integrated with the environment rather than reading as flat and neutral metal. And from there, he just adjusts the mix to build contrast, adding Hearthborn for the lighter areas and more darkness for the deeper shadows. And as the highlights begin to develop, we'll add more and more of that Hearthborn into the mixture. Right about now is when Joachim's going to start working on other non-metallic areas, this time on the gold. Using a mix of Umberroot and Glade Shard, he base coats some of the filigree and ornamentation on the Marshal. Moving on to a mix of Embervale and Sunburst Ochre for the first highlight layers, placing them according to the light source to push the reflective effect and guide our eyes. To brighten things further, he adds Sun Petal into that previous mix, lifting the highlights and warming the gold. Alright, now we return to Joachim's Grimdark Gumbo mixture. Actually, that's one I need to trademark. Be on the lookout for the new exclusive color from the Army Painter, straight from the brand commander secret stash, Grimdark Gumbo. Half tempted to throw some Cajun seasoning into the wash and see what happens. I digress. Joachim continues brightening the reflections across the steel, gradually pushing the highlights all the way up with the final addition of Ivory White into that gumbo mix. Next, he tightens the highlight placement across the steel armor. And I actually really like how he's going about this, coming back to the steel after finishing the gold trim. It gives Joachim a chance to reevaluate the volumes and push the contrast exactly where he wants it to be. And that kind of back and forth refinement is common in more advanced painting. You don't have to finish one area perfectly before moving on. You can always come back and adjust things later. You can see Joachim doing exactly that here as he lightly glazes down the gold, pulling back some of the initial contrast so it sits more naturally with the surrounding armor. Next, Joachim blocks in the remaining iron details on the Marshal with a rough base coat, and from there he builds the metals up through progressively brighter layers, introducing Ivory White and Hearthborn to establish the final highlights. Now, let's take a look at how both painters approach the gems on their Marshals, and I really like the choices right away. Tyler goes with a moody mauve, which contrasts nicely with the cooler blues and grays. Meanwhile, Joachim leans green, but a warmer green that fits beautifully with the forest environment he's been building throughout this process. Both gems are worked up using techniques very similar from the previous sections. Just keep an eye on the color graphics on screen. Danny has kindly laid those out for us, which is no small task when Joachim is throwing the entire kitchen sink into his palette. All right, we're in the home stretch now. Tyler begins building the base with a classic dirty base coat. And I've got to say, Bramble Grove is quickly becoming one of my go-to colors from the range. He's using that on the rocks, but it's incredibly versatile, sitting comfortably between grays, browns, and even subtle purples, depending on how you use it. Now Tyler's going to lay the groundwork for a snowy environment using a clever little trick. If you're trying snow basing at home, mixing Battlefield's basing glue with Battlefield's snow flock to create that initial layer is a great way to do it. Once it begins to set but it's still drying, sprinkle some loose snow flock over the top, and that extra layer creates a much more natural snow texture once everything dries. With all of that snow set, Tyler thins Frostveil heavily with water to create a very thin glaze. Using Warpaint Stabilizer here would give you even more control, but Tyler is one of the best out there, so water works just fine for him. He glazes this into the shadows and around the rocks, creating a convincing icy tone across the base. Then to push that effect even further, Tyler applies Satin Air Varnish from the airbrush range across select areas, giving the snow a subtle sheen and creating a really convincing wet snow look. Alright Joachim, let's see what you've got. He begins with a base coat of ironclad gray on the rocks and uses an alternating wet blending approach with his earlier environmental mix across the terrain. Later, he introduces additional glade shard to push the chroma of the mossy ground before applying a very thin layer of grave hollow shade. Rather than flooding the surface like a traditional wash, he applies it more like a feathered glaze, keeping that subtle effect. From there, Joachim builds texture using alternating feathering and stippling with glade shard, sun petal, and hearthborn, giving the base a lively, almost magical forest feel. Once the base is complete, you can really see how all of Joachim's earlier environmental work begins to pay off. Those reflected greens and warm tones we saw in the armor and cloak now make perfect sense with the environment he's created. To reinforce that effect, Joachim mixes another custom glaze using Stabilizer, applying it to the lower portions of the miniature to suggest that the bright forest floor is reflecting subtle color back onto the armor and cloth. That final step ties the entire miniature together beautifully. Let's get them on the round table, boys, and there you have it, 2 incredibly thematic Freeguild Marshals painted using volumes 3 and 4 of the John Blanche Masterclass series. This has been a really fun project, showcasing 2 outstanding painters that we're proud to have on the Army Painter team. A huge thanks goes to Tyler and Joachim and Danny for the video. If you've enjoyed this 2-painter tutorial format or have ideas for future videos from the Army Painter Academy, leave a comment and subscribe. We are incredibly proud to work with the legendary John Blanche to help bring his vision to more hobbyists. The John Blanche Masterclass paint sets, combined with the Warpaint's Fanatic Speed Paint, are designed to help you make those creative choices confidently and make miniature painting even more fun. Whether you're brand new to the hobby or you've been painting for decades, there's always room to experiment, explore, and push your own path forward. If you want to try this approach yourself, you can find everything used in this video at thearmypainter.com or at your friendly local game store.